Please turn to Romans chapter 2. In chapter 1, we looked at Paul's words about the coming wrath of God on the ungodly and unrighteous, which is revealed by proclaiming the gospel, and the sin and immorality that was so common in the Roman culture, and the need to repent and what that means. As we said last week, Paul is not just talking about sexual sin in Romans 1. In verses 29 through 31, he lists several sinful things these people were doing. Being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful. Perhaps the phrase haters of God sums it up. Their refusal to submit to Him and His authority leads to sin of all kinds. In chapter 2, Paul continues his warning to the Roman congregation. In chapter 2, verse 1, "Therefore you are inexcusable, O man, whoever you are who judge. For in whatever you judge another, you condemn yourself. For you who judge practice the same things." Remember, the Roman congregation was made up of both Jewish and non-Jewish believers in God of Israel and His Son, the Messiah. We will see that in Paul's letter to them. Sometimes his words are directed at the Jews, sometimes at the Gentiles who became believers, and sometimes at both. So who are these words in the first part of chapter 2 written to? Scholars have held differing opinions about this, but it seems to me that Paul's words are directed at the Jews. Here are the reasons. In verse 4, Paul seems to have the history of Israel in mind. 2, it's more likely that the people he characterizes are morally superior, as morally superior are the Jews. 3, Pharisees commonly had a superior attitude toward Gentiles, so the comments in the opening verses probably describe Jews. 4, Paul is clearly addressing Jews in verses 17 and 24, and he seems to be addressing the same people in the whole chapter. So, while the sins listed at the end of chapter 1 were characteristic of pagan Gentiles, in this context they were associated with idolatry, a sin that the people of Israel were almost constantly charged with by Yahuwah's prophets. The sinful acts of the Gentile demonstrated their lawlessness as they failed to love both God and their neighbor. Anyone who wrongly judges his neighbor is not loving him as he could, and by doing so also fails to love God. Paul points this out later in verses 21 and 22, where his bottom line is that the Jews who do these things have disobeyed the Torah and dishonored God. Idolatry is idolatry, whether its form is the gross immorality of pagans or the self-centered religion of people of Yahuwah who should know better. Both forms are manifestations of idolatry. He hates them both. Self-righteous, sinful Jews and Christians are just as guilty as the pagans who worship idols, for they all fail to meet God's standards of righteousness. Here is Paul's point. If a person judges and condemns someone while doing the same thing the other person does, he or she also judges and condemns himself or herself. Now, no one in their right mind would knowingly and openly condemn another for doing the same thing they are doing or something similar. So it may be that they are blind to the fact that they are sinning the same way. Arrogance tends to be blind. Paul wasn't necessarily saying that the Jews were committing the same sexual sins as the pagan Gentiles, but by judging them wrongly, they put inappropriately themselves in the place of God, and that is a form of idolatry. It's not judging alone that he has a problem with. It's the hypocrisy of judging others for a sin you are also guilty of committing. Yeshua addressed the same kind of problem. Please turn to Matthew chapter 7. This passage is part of Yahushua's Sermon on the Mount, and chapter 7 begins with a very well-known Bible verse. Judge not, that you be not judged. When Yahushua said this, it wasn't a new idea. He was using words and ideas that were quite familiar to Jewish people. Rabbis said this kind of thing frequently, such as, he who judges his neighbor favorably will be judged favorably by God. They taught that there are 6 things that bring a person credit in this world and profit in the world to come: study, visiting the sick, hospitality, devotion and prayer, teaching children the Torah, and thinking the best of other people. Of all the verses in the Bible, Matthew chapter 7 verse 1 is one of that almost everyone, even those who never crack open a Bible, can quote. Or maybe I should say misquote. Because this verse is one of the most misquoted Bible verses of all time. Many people try to quote this verse by saying something that sounds like King James Bible English, judge not lest ye be judged. But that's not what it says. This wording, judge not lest ye be judged, is not in any Bible version that I know of. But that's how many people misquote this verse. And not only do people usually get the exact wording wrong, they also usually get the meaning wrong. This is one of the most misunderstood, most interpreted, and most misused verses in the Bible. It's pretty common to hear people refer to this verse as they suggest that most, if not all, forms of judging are wrong. Haven't we all heard someone say, we're not supposed to judge others? Yes. As if all kinds of judgment are forbidden. And haven't we heard people say things like, yeah, he cheated on his wife, but who am I to judge? Hey, we're all sinners, right? Amen. Like Jesus said, judge not lest ye be judged. Is this what Yahushua means? No. Should cheaters and criminals and evil people escape condemnation? Should society not judge criminals at all? No, Yahushua isn't talking in Matthew 7 about the legal system. The Torah establishes the process of judging by judges. It is the duty of the courts to render judgment. This is an example of taking one verse out of context and building a doctrine around it. The foolishness of not judging contradicts God's instructions for us. And judge not lest ye be judged is used like a hammer to try to immediately stop any discussion about whether a certain behavior is right or wrong. Almost invariably, if someone says that a certain action or behavior is wrong, someone else will say, but Jesus said we are not supposed to judge anyone, implying that we're never supposed to label any behavior as sin because we're not supposed to judge. If you ever say to me, judge not lest you be judged, I just might reply to you this way. I might say, twist not scripture lest you be like Satan. Let's begin to sort this out. The original Greek word that means judge in this verse, krino, can also mean to condemn and to discern. So, it doesn't mean only judge in the sense of evaluating merits or faults, good or bad. Yahushua himself judged people. In verse 6 of this same chapter, he refers to some people as dogs and swine, clearly judging their spiritual condition. In verses 15 through 20, he speaks of false prophets. So he judged their prophetic activity and its fruit or results. Not only did Yahushua make judgments, he approved of others making judgments when done correctly or rightly. He told a man in Luke chapter 7 verse 43 that he had rightly judged. We'll see today that Yahushua definitely did not prohibit making good, wise, discerning judgments of what others do and say. So, what was he talking about in Matthew chapter 7 verse 1? Let's look at verses 3 through 5 and it should become clear. But first, let's define one of the words we see in these verses in some Bibles. In the King James Version, there's an Old English word that's not commonly used anymore. The word mote. Is that right? Mote? Okay. It's Strong's number 2595. The Greek is karphos. And Strong defines it as a dry twig or straw. Other definitions include these meanings: a small, dry particle of wood or chaff or even wool. Many Bibles, like the New King James Version, translate the word as speck. Now let's look at verses 3 through 5 of Matthew 7. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye, and look, a plank is in your own eye? In Matthew chapter 7 verse 5, hypocrite, first remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Yahushua does not say, take the plank out of your own eye, but don't say anything about the speck in your brother's eye. That would result in never judging anyone about anything. Notice who he was talking to in this passage. In verse 5, he says, hypocrite. Remember that a hypocrite is someone who says one thing and does another. They don't practice what they preach, and in this case, they also love to judge others for their motes. They're little specks or particles of dry wood, while at the same time, they have a much bigger piece of wood in their own eye. Yahushua was saying, and I paraphrase, don't judge, you hypocrites. If you're doing something wrong, don't judge others until you quit doing wrong yourself. Not that we aren't supposed to judge whether certain actions or behavior is sinful or not, but that we be careful and honest with ourselves and be willing to be judged by the same standard of judgment. In other words, if you are going to say that what someone else is doing is wrong, then you better be prepared to be judged yourself by the same standard. If you don't want your life to be scrutinized, then don't judge anyone. If you can stand the scrutiny, then go for it. Again, the idea is don't judge as the hypocrites do while you're doing the same thing, or even worse than what you're judging someone for. If you're doing something wrong, stop doing it. Clean up your own act first. Then you can judge others. Yahushua doesn't say to never judge others, just be sure to examine yourself first and remove the sin from your own life before you go proclaiming judgment on others. Only then can you truly help your brother. Few things bother us more than being criticized or judged for something by someone who is doing the same thing or worse. Perhaps trying to pull others down because of his or her own secret shame and guilt. Trying to somehow build himself or herself up to look better by comparison or feel better. We could see this passage as a teaching on helping people. And Yahushua used the example of having something in your eye. In order to get it out, you often need the help of someone else to see it and remove it. When we see something wrong in the life of a family member or a friend, we need to point it out and help them deal with it. When we do that, we are serving them, not condemning them. And this involves determining if what they're doing is right or wrong behavior. We can and should do that, but it must be done with a loving attitude and not a condemning, superior, hypocritical attitude. Pointing out destructive behavior in another person is actually an incredible and brave way to love your neighbor, especially when the situation becomes so serious that it requires intervention. It would have been more loving to step in long before it got so serious. All too often we have heard sincere, misinformed Christians and unbelievers alike say, I don't want to judge anybody, but, and ironically, the one who says we shouldn't judge is frequently finding fault with someone else for judging. Why would they criticize others for judging? Isn't that judging too? It's almost funny, isn't it? To judge someone and condemn them for judging makes one a hypocrite. If a pastor teaches, don't judge, with regard to sexual immorality or abortion, what would he say about someone taking money out of the collection plate? There are several Bible passages that teach the responsibility of righteous judgment by the people of Yahweh. Let's look at a few of those verses beginning in the Torah. First, let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 16. Then I commanded your judges at that time, saying, hear the cases between your brethren, and judge righteously between a man and his brother, or the stranger who is with him. Here in the Torah, the foundation of all Scripture, the principle of judging is commanded by Moses. Of course, he was referring to those who were appointed to make official, legal judgments in the cases that came up between the Israelites in the wilderness, but it still establishes the principle. A principle that was stated before in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 15. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. In righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. In this verse, Moses was making the point that righteous judgment is not swayed or influenced by the social status or position or wealth or poverty of the person being judged. It is to be impartial. In Psalms chapter 37, verse 30 says, the mouth of the righteous speaks wisdom, and his tongue talks of justice. Instead of justice, both the King James Version and the Eth Sefer say judgment. It refers to rendering a proper verdict that accomplishes justice. God promises rewards of delight and blessing on the person who rebukes the wicked in Proverbs chapter 24, verses 24 and 25. He who says to the wicked, "You are righteous," him the people will curse. Nations will abhor him. But those who rebuke the wicked will have delight, and a good blessing will come upon them. While our God, Yahweh, is our ultimate judge, He has also commanded us to judge according to His word. For example, in Proverbs chapter 31, verse 9, He says, "Open your mouth, judge righteously." Yahweh says through the prophet Ezekiel that Levites will judge during the Messianic era. It is written in Ezekiel chapter 44, verse 24. "They shall stand as judges and judge it according to my judgments." And Yahweh said these words to the high priest in Zechariah chapter 3, verse 7. "Then you shall also judge my house." This principle also is found in the apostolic scriptures or New Testament. Messiah gives some important instructions in Matthew chapter 6, verses 14 and 15. "For if you forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses." How can we obey Yahushua by forgiving others for their sin unless we judge and recognize and identify this behavior as sin? We can't. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 6, Yahushua gives his disciples some instructions that require judging. "Do not give what is holy to the dogs, nor cast your pearls before swine." He's not talking about animals here. Dogs is how Jewish people referred to Gentiles, people who weren't Jewish or Israelite, or weren't in covenant with the Creator. Of course, when we repent of sin and come to faith in Messiah, we become spiritual Israelites. So these instructions apply to us today. If we want to obey what Yahushua says here, how could we know who the dogs or the swine are unless we judge other people to figure it out? Wouldn't this require judging to identify who the dogs and the swine are? He says in Matthew chapter 18, verse 15, "Moreover, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him. If he hears you, you have gained your brother." How would we know if a brother has sinned against us so we could go tell him his fault unless we first judge that he has said or done something wrong? Yahushua specifically instructs us to judge in John chapter 7, verse 24. "Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment." So we are actually commanded to judge by Yahushua himself. Paul also expects believers to be discerning and to make judgments. He tells us in Romans chapter 12, verse 9, to abhor what is evil. Before we can abhor or hate what is evil, we have to judge it as being evil. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 15, Paul says this, "He who is spiritual judges all things." In Galatians chapter 1, verse 9, Paul says, "If anyone preaches any other gospel to you than what you have received, let him be accursed." How would we do that without judging people's gospel message and comparing it to the true gospel that was preached by Yahushua and the apostles? We would have to judge and evaluate it to be able to compare it with the truth. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14, Paul tells the believers in the city of Corinth, "Do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? And what communion has light with darkness? This verse is usually associated with marriage, but also applies to just about any kind of partnership. How in the world could you obey Paul's instructions here without evaluating and judging whether your possible future spouse or business partner is a believer? Paul says this in Philippians chapter 3, verse 2. Beware of dogs, beware of evil workers, beware of the mutilation. The mutilation, what the King James Version calls the consension, refers either to people who cut or mutilate their flesh in pagan rituals, or to the Judaizers who went around saying that the Gentiles who became believers in Yahushua had to be circumcised before they could be considered part of the people of God. To be able to beware of these types of people would require judging their words and actions. We read more of Paul's instructions in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 22. Abstain from every form of evil. How can we abstain from and avoid evil unless we can judge something and identify it as being evil? We should pray for God to help us see the difference between what is good and what is evil and avoid the evil. Avoiding evil, fleeing temptation, and clinging to what is good and lovely all involve making judgments of whether things and people are good or evil. The Bible tells us several times to rebuke the wicked, even our neighbor, and this requires judging their action as wicked. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor. In Proverbs chapter 24, verse 25, but those who rebuke the wicked will have delight, and a good blessing will come upon them. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 5, it is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. In Luke chapter 17, verse 3, take heed to yourselves. If your brother sins against you, rebuke him. And if he repents, forgive him. The Bible even says in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 2, that the people of God will be involved in judging after Messiah returns and establishes his kingdom. Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world will be judged by you, are you unworthy to judge the smallest matters? Some of us are going to be doing some official judging in the kingdom. But Paul's main point is that since we're going to be judging the world, we ought to be able to judge smaller matters now. He was scolding the Corinthians for not being willing to do so. Paul says in the very next verse that one day we'll not only be judging the world. Do you not know that we shall judge angels? How much more things that pertain to this life? Again, Paul's point is that since we'll someday be judging such important things as angels, then we also should judge the things pertaining to this life. In the next two verses, he basically told the Corinthians to start judging now because they were going to need the practice. This idea that at least some followers of Yahushua will be doing some judging in the Messianic era is confirmed by the following verses, beginning with the verse from John's vision of the end of days in Revelation chapter 20, verse 4. And I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was committed to them. Who is it that is seated on these thrones? It can't be angels. They are never described as sitting on thrones. So who is it? At Yahushua's last Passover Seder, we read in Luke chapter 22, verses 29 and 30, that he told his apostles it would be them. And I bestow upon you a kingdom, just as my Father bestowed one upon me, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. He made a similar statement in Matthew chapter 19, verse 28. So Yahushua said to them, Surely I say to you, that in the regeneration, when the Son of Man sits on the throne of his glory, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. This is consistent with the promise he makes in Revelation chapter 2, verses 26 and 27. And he who overcomes and keeps my works until the end, to him I will give power over the nations. He shall rule them with a rod of iron. But there may be more than 12 thrones or seats for these in authority. Revelation chapter 4, verse 4 describes 24 seats and 24 elders sitting in white robes with gold crowns on their heads. It may be that these 24 elders represent the 12 tribes of Israel plus the 12 apostles, together representing all the people of God, including those who lived before Yeshua and those who lived afterward. Whoever it is, the point is that God has some people designated to judge the 12 tribes of Israel. According to the Webster's Dictionary, to judge means to discern, to distinguish, to form an opinion, to compare facts or ideas and perceive their agreement or disagreement, and thus to distinguish truth from falsehood. So when you say that your friend or your neighbor is a good person, you are stating an opinion and judging just as much as when you say that a thief is a bad person. It's funny that those who say we shouldn't judge don't hesitate to call someone a good person. But that's judging too. The only object to judging if it results in a negative judgment. To those who think that life would be so wonderful if no one judged others, I ask you to consider what life on earth would be like if there were no judging. Schools couldn't evaluate the progress of students. Everyone would graduate regardless of their level of learning. Students couldn't be graded or disciplined because we shouldn't judge anyone. Single people would marry anyone that asked them without worrying about their character or beliefs. And if they beat you up or cheat on you, well, you shouldn't get so mad because after all, we shouldn't judge anyone. Parents couldn't discipline their children or grandchildren and teach them not to steal, lie, do drugs, or give in to peer pressure because after all, we shouldn't judge anyone. Parents would have to leave their children with anyone who said they were qualified to be a babysitter without checking their background. And they couldn't be upset if this babysitter turned out to be a child molester because after all, we shouldn't judge anyone. All the prisons would be empty and thieves, serial killers, drug dealers, rapists, and murderers would be loose in your neighborhood because after all, we shouldn't judge anyone. We couldn't judge any religious doctrines. And we would have to allow false teachers to teach in our congregation and fellowships because discerning is the same thing as judging, and we shouldn't judge anyone. You can see how ridiculous life would be without judging. The notion that judging is wrong is ludicrous. The devil has been successful to push the church further and further into a corner while everyone else comes out of the closet with their sins. Judge not is a cliche used by those who want to hide the light of God's truth under a basket. It's a mantra for shirking responsibility. Most often, those who tell you not to judge them do so because they are either hiding something or want to continue doing it without reaping any negative consequences for it. Judge not, lest you be judged, has become the hypocrite's golden rule. On the campuses, students say that we shouldn't judge fornicators, drunkards, liars, or homosexuals. However, they fail to realize that sin harms them and their neighbors. A caring, loving believer will judge all situations according to the Word of God and call sinners to repentance. In today's culture, tolerance is considered to be one of the highest virtues. Even the church has become intimidated by the world. Atheists and liberals say things like, "You religious bigots," "You hate mongers," "You intolerant people, don't judge me." Do you see how they are judging those who judge them? And the percentage of believers who have fallen from this deception seems to be really high, especially in mainline denominational churchianity. Yet the Bible clearly commands us to judge so we won't be deceived. Why would the idea of judging be opposed so vehemently, attacked by society? Because if the people of God stop judging and stop using our common sense, we won't be able to distinguish good from evil. We'll buy into the politically correct idea of moral relativism that says what's good for you may not be good for me, and we, along with our families and friends, will not only be deceived, but will make it even worse by spreading the deception. And it's even more disturbing to see congregational leaders saying, "Do not judge." Many pastors lead their flocks astray and manipulate them and keep them under their control by telling them that they have a critical spirit, or that they are prideful or judgmental, while all the flocks are trying to do this is evaluate the circumstances and discern the truth. If you ever find yourself in a congregation like that, don't put up with it and get out of there. This lie has practically paralyzed the body of Messiah. Where do we get the idea that we should never judge? To illustrate one possible answer, and to show the church world has accepted this idea of not judging, I want to present an imaginary dialogue for you now. A dialogue between a junior demon and a senior demon. This is like what Christian scholars and author C.S. Lewis did years ago in a book called The Screwtape Letters. And this imaginary conversation came from a brochure by a preacher acquaintance of mine named Bob Enyart. I'll just use the names Junior and Senior for these characters, and I'll use a different voice for each character as I read. I was thanking him for this earlier. Let's see. Let's see, Junior. Believers have so many weapons that they're disposable. It's hard to neutralize them. It takes a huge effort just to offset the work of one believer. And Senior, your one-on-one approach is inefficient. This is the age of TV, radio, the internet, and mass marketing. If you can undermine the whole group at once, then you've accomplished something. Junior, unfortunately, I'm not highly productive. In the time it takes me to frustrate one believer, I could be tempting a dozen heathens. Senior, don't lose heart, Junior. We're implementing a plan to impair the whole church with a single strategy. Junior, I don't see how that will be possible. The Christians I've seen are dedicated to warning others about hell. It's all I can do to just get one of them distracted for a short time. Senior, we're going to use their leader's own words. Junior, no, please don't do that. Don't even joke about using his words. I can't take it. And Senior, if you're ever going to grow up and to be an effective demon, Junior, You're going to have to learn to use the enemy's words against him. Junior, it just seems so dangerous. Which words are we going to use? Senior, judge not. Junior, I don't understand. Why he would tell them not to judge? That's confusing. He commanded his followers to rebuke, to admonish, and to judge dozens of times in his book. And that's what they're out there doing. And I might add, it's causing me a lot of grief. Senior, when their leader said those words, he was speaking of hypocrites. Judge not, you hypocrite. As he said later in the same paragraph. Junior, yeah, but how are we going to use judge not to neutralize the whole church? Senior, we're going to get them to ignore the fact that he was talking to hypocrites. He said that hypocrites should not judge, at least not until they stop doing wrong deeds and actions themselves. But we're going to make them think none of them should judge. Junior, that's brilliant. If you can pull it off, if we can get them to stop judging, then they won't rebuke the wicked, and they won't be able to admonish those who are sexually immoral. Senior, it's even more brilliant than you realize. If we can seduce Christians into following the instructions for hypocrites, we will turn them into hypocrites. It's like the government workers who follow foolish rules so precisely, they are transformed from human beings into bureaucrats. Drones who mindlessly dispense red tape, regardless of the misfortune they cause. The slave who willingly obeys his master begins to conform to the master. If believers willingly submit to an instruction for hypocrites, they will conform to hypocrisy. Eventually, with a little evil luck, we might stop them from confronting unbelievers altogether because, as you know, Junior, to confront unbelievers requires judging. And if they don't judge unbelievers, they are hypocrites, professing the gospel but denying its power. Junior, great, I'm excited. When do we start? Senior, everything is underway already. Just do your part. Junior, and that is? Senior, make sure your targets read a little of the book as possible. Don't get too worried if they stick to their favorite 20 cliche verses, but make sure they remain ignorant of most of the word. And Junior, Master, you are brilliant. And Senior, you can call me Master if you want, but don't let the boss hear you. Oh, man. When Yahushua says, judge not that you be not judged, I think he's teaching us two things. Don't judge someone for doing something we think is wrong unless we have our own act cleaned up first, especially if we're doing the same thing. And to be very careful about judging someone's heart, their intentions and motives. Only God can do that. We can judge their fruit, their words, and their actions, and the end results of what they say and do, but we just cannot always accurately see what's going on in their minds and hearts. And we certainly shouldn't pronounce the type of judgment on them that is reserved for God. In other words, we shouldn't proclaim that so-and-so is going to be punished by God for doing such and such, or that so-and-so is going to hell. Only Yahushua has the authority to judge anyone's salvation and judgment regarding punishment and chastisement for sinful behavior belongs to God. If we put ourselves in the position of making those kinds of judgments, we will then be judged for it. We will answer to God for trying to usurp His authority. People who have genuinely experienced the love and mercy of God should be willing to show love and mercy to others. Be careful about having a judgmental attitude and looking for faults in others. A judgmental attitude presumes the worst, while an attitude of godly love hopes for the best. And Matthew chapter 6 says that God will forgive us if we forgive others. And in the same way, He will judge us as we judge others. Let's always be careful to make honest, fair judgments, but that does not mean to never judge at all. Our guidelines are: judge righteously, judge by the Word of God and His principles, judge impartially and with all the facts, judge without hypocrisy, and judge ourselves first. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 31. For if we would judge ourselves, we would not be judged. The first few verses of Matthew 7 are really a condemnation of hypocrisy, not of judging. And that is Paul's point at the beginning of Romans 2. We are to judge, but also to judge ourselves first to see if we are guilty of sin, so we can practice what we preach and walk our talk. Before we can judge others appropriately, we must have our own life cleaned up by repenting from any and all sin in our life. But then we should be prepared to do what 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 verse 21 says, and test all things. In other words, we are to examine all things and judge them.